G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett. I'm Deputy Director at the Australia Institute and welcome to our webinar series. Thanks so much for coming along tonight. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Australia. In Canberra, sorry. Sovereignty was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and I pay my respects to the traditional owners and to elders past and present. The Australia Institute does do these webinars at least weekly, sometimes more than that, but days and times do vary. So make sure you head on over to australiainstitute.org.au for all our upcoming webinars. And just a few tips before we begin this evening. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can ask questions of our panel and upvote questions from other people and make comments on them as well. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll boot you out if we have to. And finally, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and it'll be posted up on our YouTube channel. That's australiainstitute.tv after this, probably within 24 hours. So you all might realise that things have been pretty bleak in the past couple of years, certainly in Australia. In 2020, at the beginning, you might remember we had the Black Summer bushfires, we had floods. Here in Canberra, we had hailstorms and record heat waves and the worst air pollution in the world for several weeks. And this was closely followed by a global pandemic and our first recession in decades. But also on the flip side, for a brief period of time during the pandemic, the federal and state governments lifted hundreds of thousands of people out of poverty by doubling the unemployment benefit and making childcare free, even though it was only temporary. That was kind of something that I thought would have been politically impossible if you'd asked me in January last year. So that's why I'm delighted tonight to introduce our guest for this evening, the UK's Shadow Secretary for State for Business, Energy and Industry, the member for Doncaster North, and of course the former leader of UK Labor, Ed Miliband, to talk about his new book, Go Big. Thanks so much for joining us, Ed.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, for the past 4 years, Ed has been discovering and interviewing brilliant people from all around the world who are successfully tackling some of the world's big problems, transforming communities and pioneering global movements as part of his Reasons to Be Cheerful podcast. And that loosely inspired this book, Go Big. It's a really great read. I'm only kind of partway through it, I will admit, because I've also been listening to the podcast, Ed. So I'm really excited about this conversation this evening. And Ed will be in conversation with Wayne Swan. Wayne is the National President of the Australian Labor Party and, of course, the former Treasurer and Deputy Prime Minister of Australia. And I hear, Wayne, the new Chair of Industry Superfund CBUS, is that right?
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
Congratulations. And Wayne, I'll hand over to you to kick us off.
Oh, well, thanks very much. And thanks to the Australia Institute for putting this on this evening. And thanks to Ed, because I think Ed has done us an enormous favour. Just to remind everyone that some of the policy issues we face are not too big, and that big policy issues can also be tackled. In fact, if you go back to our experience just during the Great Recession, or what we call here the global financial crisis, going too small was a sure way to fail. And I think what we are finding in this pandemic is that we've essentially got permission, if you like, to handle some of the three great challenges, or all of the three great challenges that Ed canvasses in the book. Growing income and wealth inequality, for example, is dramatic. It is responsible for an enormous amount of political polarisation. The whole issue of climate change and responses to it. And of course, also the loss of faith and trust in democratic norms. I mean, now is a great time to be talking about comprehensive interventions in the economy, particularly by governments, because I think if the pandemic tells us anything, is that very significant transitions in economies have to be led by government action. And so much of that has been a no-no in the neoliberal policy handbook for so many years. So there is a great opportunity now to take some of the lessons of the pandemic and apply them not only to public health, but also to, in particular, as Ed, I think, points out very clearly in his book, climate change. I did enjoy your reflections on Copenhagen. I know how it went down here and the impact it had on our government. But if you just take, for example, our carbon pricing scheme that we put through in 2011 and the clean energy package, that proved, even in difficult political circumstances, that big policy challenges and big responses could be put in place by governments, even in the teeth of entrenched opposition from powerful interest groups in the community. There's also a lesson in what happened to our carbon pricing scheme and our clean energy package that went through, that big reforms are always opposed by the small government crowd, and they're never settled. And I know this has probably been the case with health in the UK, the National Health Service, that great reform after the war. Like Medicare here, the great reform of Whitlam in the early 70s, has always been under the challenge from the neoliberals, the small government crowd, trying to pull it down. So when big reforms are won, sometimes we in the policy wonk land forget that we have to fight to keep them and that they're not necessarily taken for granted. And I guess to finish off with Medicare here in Australia, what would our response to the pandemic look like if it hadn't been for our public health system? So as a progressive, I take great heart in how many of our initiatives have saved our countries during these pandemics, but we don't talk enough about that. So that's why I reckon Ed's book is timely and hopefully makes it a bestseller, Ed.
Well, thanks, Wayne.
Ed, I was going to ask you to just kick us off with how you started the book and kind of, was it, inspired by that podcast and giving people a bit of hope that there's solutions out there?
I mean, look, in truth, Ebony, it was inspired partly by defeat, if that doesn't sound like too much of a contradiction, because I led the Labour Party in 2015, as you said, and lost the election. And then I started doing this podcast a couple of years later because my co-host, Buzz, who's now my co-host, approached me and said, look, there are great ideas around the world about the things that can be done. I think there's a real appetite for these ideas. And really the reason to write the book is, and I think Wayne put it incredibly well, if I may say so. I mean, I think it's a sort of three-part argument, really. When you look at the way the world is, how can you think to yourself, small tinkering around the edges is the answer? So if you look at the climate crisis or the inequality crisis or the democratic crisis, exactly as Wayne said, we know, for example, on climate, we are literally in the decisive decade. And the decisions we make in this decade, as David Attenborough actually said, will have implications for hundreds, if not thousands of years to come. So, just that on its own, or the long-standing crisis of inequality, tinkering around the edges isn't going to do it. Secondly, that, and this is really focused on a British audience, but maybe hopefully helpful to an Australian audience too, there are actually, think of any problem that we face, there are actually solutions around the world. And whether it's what they're doing in Vienna to solve their housing crisis or to prevent a housing crisis, or some of the initiatives, take an example like Alaska and the permanent fund dividend, which is a universal payment that goes to all citizens in Alaska, or flexible working and the way that is done in Scandinavia, father's leave in Iceland. There's just a plethora of examples around the world that can inspire us and drive us forward and make us think, well, maybe we could do that. If that country can do it, why can't we? So that's the second part of the argument. And then the third part of the argument is, and the last part of the book, is really to say to people that actually there's lots of reasons for progressives to feel gloomy. But actually, and I look at the different campaigns that have happened and are happening, where, just take an example like the fight for $15 minimum wage in the US, started with 200 fast food workers in New York, now covers 22 million people, looked outlandish when it was first started a decade ago. So it's also to say to people, look, there is reason for hope, even amongst some gloomy times, and you can be part of the change. And it's not, this change won't, I say in the book, and I guess Wayne would agree with this, that, politics is too important to be left to politicians. It's not just about politicians. It's about what movements achieve, and movements create the ground, the soil in which politics is determined. So that's really the argument of the book, and I hope it's sort of interest to not just to a British audience, but audiences elsewhere.
Yeah, no, I definitely was reading it thinking nearly everything that you covered was pretty applicable to the Australian context. Wayne, did you find the same thing?
I did, and I think climate is a classic example, because you can't win big reforms and you can't sustain big reforms without constantly being out there generating a movement for them. Now, when we managed to get the clean energy package and carbon pricing through the Senate, I think it's fair to say that the people that were most fervent about it thought it had been won. And as I moved around the community and we started to experience the backlash, I was out there, and particularly when I was interacting with the environmental movement, they'd be saying, well, why haven't you done this on offshore conservation or whatever? And if you don't do it, we're going to give you a kick in the up the bum. When in fact, we should have been continuing to fight for the gain we'd just made. So, we put it in our pocket and assume that because it's been enacted in the Parliament, that the forces of reaction aren't going to turn around and come. Well, they do always turn around and come. They've turned around on a number of occasions in Australia and came for Medicare. And unfortunately for the country, they came for carbon pricing and clean energy. So there is a real lesson, because you can't actually get the big reform and sustain it unless you're constantly out there in communities talking to people about the rationale for it. And that's become much more important in an age of disinformation. It is much easier to tear down something like carbon pricing in an age of Facebook and large media companies where scare campaigns and disinformation is so much easier to get out there. So the progressive learning that I've had is that not only is the task of maintaining support become more complex in a campaigning sense, also we have to understand, and this goes back to a point Ed makes in the book, that there are two ways of getting big changes or big policies through. One is like we experienced post-war, where the need for it was demonstrated and it came in a whoosh. But if I were to use carbon pricing again as an example of what you might do in a staged way to get a big reform, I often think that perhaps if we'd had the price on carbon a little lower in our carbon pricing, we might have actually avoided the worst of the backlash. So the most important thing was to get the scheme in place in the first place and settle it down. I think you're completely right about that, Wayne, and it's important to say, I think somebody may have raised this in the chat, incremental change can take you to a larger change. It can be a pathway to a larger change. It's just, if it's incremental change that doesn't really going anywhere, then it's no good. But if it is envisioning a different future, I think the other point I would make, and I think this may be different than the Australian experience, but I do make this point in the book, is I think progressives need to also focus on the fact that the opponent has changed. Yeah, our opponent has changed. You see, I think that I represent a constituency in Doncaster North that voted more than 70% for Brexit. That wasn't obviously my position, but the Brexit campaign was an argument which took quite a lot of the causes that the left had espoused: stagnant wages, need for industrial investment, all of those things, and said this is what Brexit will deliver. Now, we can certainly argue about whether that's true or not, but it's so striking to me that my constituents were saying to me, I'm voting for Brexit because I want a new beginning. I want something better. In other words, I don't feel this economy is working for me. And if you think about Trump too, it was, of course, Trump relied on a Republican base. People would vote Republican at every election, but he also crucially won because he converted people who felt the same, who felt a similar sentiment. And if I think about the next election in the UK, we're not going to be facing a Tory party that says we just want to conserve. Johnson's argument, if it is Johnson at the election, will be Boris Johnson, will be, look, I'm for change. I'm for, as he calls it, levelling up. I'm for tackling inequality. And so, in a way,
it makes it all the more important that we fight on this ground, and we show we have more plausible, but also, actual real solutions rather than false solutions.
Yeah, it reminds me, Wayne, kind of touching there on, the importance of regulating big tech, which I know is another big subject that you touch on there. But actually, his points reminded me of one of the stories from the book, particularly around climate change, where you talked about meeting activists who never saw climate change as an issue for their community until they began to see it as a social justice issue. That, for example, a lot of African American communities live right beside coal-fired power stations and have high rates of asthma as a consequence and things like that, and finding different ways for community organisers and activists to bring people into the movement and understand that it's sometimes, much bigger than that one particular issue. I wonder if you could just talk to us about that.
I think that's such an important point, Ebony. If we just talk about climate change as a future threat, which of course it is, we have to be truth-telling about that. I don't think we will do enough to take people with us. We have to. We can't say to people who are worried about getting to the end of the week, well, you're going to have to leave your worries to one side because it's only the end of the world that matters. Of course, it's right that the climate crisis, we're in the decisive decade and we have to tackle it. But at the same time, we have to tackle these social justice issues. And in a sense, the way I put it is, we can't just put a green coat of paint on an unfair economy. Now, I actually personally think we can do this, because actually, if you think about the ways in which we can tackle climate change, it can create the jobs of the future, decent, well-paid, unionized jobs. It can insulate homes and cut or hopefully eliminate fuel poverty. It can create green spaces for people, a different transport system. As we go through this transformation of our economy, I think as progressives, we owe it to the values that we hold dear to also tackle these deep economic and social injustices and putting them at the center of the climate argument. And look, I know from the debates in Australia that there are really difficult issues here, and they're not easy. But it seems to me, unless you put workers and citizens and particularly those who are potentially vulnerable at the center of this, you're not going to succeed. But if you do that, I think that is your best hope of succeeding. And that is the genius of the Green New Deal, the idea of the Green New Deal, because it takes the climate argument and puts it together with the economic and social justice argument. And the other thing I would say is, and maybe I would say this, but I think it's Labour parties that are going to do this, because we can put green and red together, if you like, and certainly that's the way I'm arguing the case here. Not just that the government, our government, which says it's committed to climate change, but is really failing on delivering on it. Not just it's failing to deliver, but it's failing to deliver in a fair way.
Wayne, talking about fairness, that reminds me that Australia's response, your response as Treasurer during the global financial crisis, part of that package was of stimulus was a lot of social housing and things aimed at reducing inequality. That's something Ed's book touches on. How important was that for you as Treasurer when looking at a kind of a larger problem, but solving other problems along the way in your response?
Oh, absolutely massive. But don't forget that we gave the single biggest increase in the age pension in history, which was the single biggest reduction in poverty in our history as a consequence of that. So very much so. So our response to the GFC was large and it was ongoing. Unfortunately, in a number of other countries, particularly in the United States, their initial response was too small and it was pulled out too early. And I think you can probably say the same about Britain after the change of government there as well. The consequence for both those countries was a stagnant economy and growing inequality as the asset bubble pumped up on loose monetary policy. In this country, we avoided a lot of that because we had a huge social spend as well. It wasn't just in social housing, it wasn't just in pensions. You might recall we also did paid parental leave. In the middle of all of it as well, a huge reform, and of course went on to do NDIS, and a number of other very big reforms. what the pandemic shows is the utility of that, or the importance of that social spending, and how you can have immediate impacts as well as long-term structural impacts on opportunity in your economy. The thing I love about the book, and I like about the current policy debate we're having, is that we are seeing in operation, whether they're perfect policies or not, the power of public policy to transform people's lives. And of course, that is a concept that lay behind what they did in Britain post-World War II. It's a concept that lay behind not just what happened with Roosevelt in the US, but Lyndon Johnson's Great War against poverty. What we've seen in the deployment of resources here is something that we can easily do and transform into what you can call a Green New Deal, or we can call any number of things. But we can certainly manage the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy in a reasonably quick time through the deployment of smart industry policy, good budget policy, and good labour market policy. We've got to bring them together. The problem is avoiding the deep scepticism amongst people that these will actually ever hit the ground.
Yeah.
I think there's a really, sorry to interject, I think there's a really interesting point which is worth exploring in what Wayne says, which is about, if you like, the transferability of the response to the pandemic. Because I mean, look, I am so struck here. We've had this furlough scheme, which has essentially paid a very significant proportion of people's wages because the businesses are shut down. We've seen significant grants to businesses. We don't think government's done everything right, but it has been a very significant response. And I mean, it is so interesting that, and right, that government acted in relation to the pandemic. And then if you take the climate crisis, I mean, all of the evidence is that there's a very interesting report from our independent Office of Budget Responsibility that came out in July on this. All of the evidence is that the costs of acting are less than the costs of not acting, because of the costs we will store up for future generations. But also what's so interesting about their analysis is the costs of acting slowly are much greater than the costs of acting quick. Because actually, if you act too slowly, you lock in the high carbon, which you'll then eventually have to do something about: high carbon buildings, high carbon infrastructure, and so on. So I'd be interested to know, Wayne, from you, and indeed from you, Ebony, what you think about this as to how transferable is the response to the pandemic?
Well, I think it's transferable at a number of levels, but the fastest way to failure is to go small when you're in the middle of a catastrophic economic event, for some of the reasons that you've just said, because the costs build up very quickly. And then, of course, there's little you can do if you wait too long, when people have been unemployed with no income for 12 months to 18 months and so on. So, we've had a real lesson about size and proportionate response here, because in this country, our response to the GFC was seen as being, or argued by Conservatives as being, far too large, when in fact it was certainly very large, the largest in the world bar China. But it gave us ongoing strength. But the deployment of fiscal policy to bring about what we all require for the sort of social harmony and equity and the decency of society, to bring about full employment, is within our grasp.
Yeah, I guess my observation would be, Ed, that particularly with a Conservative government here, that was really, its main economic policy was aiming for a budget surplus with really not much else behind it. And then, I think none of us would have expected. We also had a wage subsidy scheme called JobKeeper here. They doubled the unemployment benefit, which has been below the poverty line for many years. But a lot of that was quite huge in the moment, not just in terms of the size of the response, but the political party that it was coming from. They really had to be dragged, in particular by the union movement, to the wage subsidy scheme. But as Wayne was talking about, I think it did show people that you know, politics can change really quickly if the impetus is there. And it showed, you know, that some of our political parties can be flexible when they're kind of forced to be. But I think we've already touched on this idea of, you know, the importance of government in people's lives and the good changes that it can make. But unfortunately for us, a lot of those great measures were quite temporary. Just sticking, I guess, with the idea of reducing inequality, you mentioned at the top of this webinar the Vienna social housing. That struck me as a really amazing story in terms of the go big ideas that you covered. Can you tell us a little bit more about what Vienna does? Because Australia certainly has a massive housing affordability problem as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a really interesting story. It's just basically that ever since the interwar period, Vienna, the capital city of Austria, has been building social housing at scale. I think it's something like 2/3 of their housing is either social housing or subsidized housing of some form. And, you know, it means that it's a capital city where people can afford to live, rich and poor. It's significantly sort of lower rents than you get elsewhere. And it sort of makes a huge difference to mixed communities and tackling the housing, preventing a housing crisis. Whereas, you know, and that this has particular meaning in the UK because ever since Mrs. Thatcher came in, she basically said, look, let's stop building social housing. We had a massive social housing boom after the World War II under both Labour and Conservative governments. But she basically said, let's stop building social housing. And so we have a massive housing crisis here, a massive and ongoing housing crisis. We have actually rates of home ownership have now fallen. We have a very, very insecure private rented sector, massive waiting lists for social housing, homelessness, but not just homelessness, deep insecurity of people renting in the private sector. And, you know, I was part, as a backbencher, I'm now obviously back on the front line, but as a backbencher, I was part of a social housing commission, which was cross-party and cross-sector experts and tenants and residents. It was followed the terrible Grenfell Tower fire here that people may have heard about, and I think what's so interesting about that is it united people from across the political spectrum in thinking we've got to invest at scale in social housing. And also I think so interesting about this is it's partly because it will help families and people to live, but it also it's the backbone of a functioning housing market. And it's not just Vienna that does it. Singapore, other European countries. There's lots of other countries that are doing this in different ways. But from our point of view, we've had 4 decades of an experiment in not building social housing, and it hasn't worked. And governments, I'm afraid, governments of both parties have tried everything to solve this housing crisis, apart from building at large scale.
Yeah, we might go to questions from the audience in just a minute. I can see we've got about 820 people on the webinar with us tonight. So thank you again so much for joining us. I know you're coming to us from all around Australia. I think I spotted in the comments someone from New Zealand and other places across the world. Thank you. We'll get to questions in just a second. Ed, before we go to those additional questions from the audience, the other thing I wanted to touch on, because we do find ourselves in a moment of crisis in a global pandemic and you know, things have really changed there. I was really struck again by the story that you told about, I think it was a volunteer or a council person called Pat during the floods, and kind of his ability to be very responsive in an emergency situation to the needs of his constituents, and the fact that he just kind of bent the rules to make things happen and didn't really stick to a rigid bureaucratic kind of response. And your observation was, well, can we work more like that outside of emergency situations? Can you just tell us a little bit more about Pat and what struck you from his response?
Well, I'm glad you asked me about that, actually, because, well, look, Pat Hagen is a guy who's a council worker in my constituency, and we've unfortunately had two sets of terrible floods in my constituency in Doncaster in 2007 and 2019, with some of the same people flooded out. And this is supposed to be places where flooding was a 1 in 100 year event. It's happened twice in barely a decade. And Pat is the sort of, he got an award from Her Majesty the Queen for his efforts in the 2007 floods, and when they hit in 2019, the council knew to call Pat. I think what's so interesting about him, and what I kind of learned from him during this crisis, in particular in 2019, as I observed him and worked with him, was, this sense of the rules and the bureaucracy just get in the way. And I think, the reason I tell this story, and the reason I have a chapter in the book devoted to it, is I think that the left, and I kind of include myself in this, is kind of good at talking about the failings of the market and less good about talking about the failings of the state. And look, we believe in the power of the state and the power of the state to do good. But I think we always have to be thinking, how can the state be more responsive? And there's a conservative sort of contracting out privatization model that doesn't work. There was a model that we did when we were in government between 1997 and 2010, which was setting lots of targets. That had its role, but it could be quite constraining of the front line. And really where I come out is saying, look, you've got to find ways in which you empower the front line and also involve communities. I think somebody's been talking about this in the chat, actually. Involve communities in solving their problems, participatory budgeting, getting communities to input into what they want to see. And I don't think the left, at least as far as in Britain is concerned, takes this seriously enough, this question of how do we make the state work better? How do we have a more responsive state? A state where people can really own the solutions. There are good experiments being done around the country, local authorities and others, but I think it is a really, really important idea for us. I think it's the Finns have this idea called humble government. Government that experiments, learns from its mistakes, doesn't pretend everything will be got right the first time. I think there's a kind of strong case for government to be humble, not in its ambitions, but in its sense of learning.
I love that idea. We've got a Nordic Policy Centre at the Australia Institute. We might have a look into that humble government idea. That strikes me as quite appropriate. Wayne, do you have a response to that?
I don't think we can underestimate the enduring impact of this housing crisis that we're currently in here. It will have a dramatic impact on inequality over time. And generational inequality, with large numbers of people just locked out of the housing market. So from my perspective, I think it's not just intergenerational income inequality that we're dealing with, it's intergenerational housing inequality that is going to have quite a marked impact. And I don't think we know all the solutions, but the one thing I do know is that the government is going to have to, I think over time, more directly intervene in supply, and the sort of measures that we took back in the first stimulus package would certainly be a significant part of any response. It's not the be all and end all, but the capacity of someone on average wages to buy a home over time has been dramatically eroded here over recent years.
Yeah, that's certainly the case. I'll go now to questions from the audience, but Ed, I ordered your book and it's arrived, but it's currently at our office and Canberra is in lockdown and I'm from home. So can you just hold it up for us? Everyone, that's Ed's book, Go Big. It is available in bookstores and there's the red hot copy sitting in the Australia Institute office, unfortunately. I've just been reading it on my Kindle and I really do recommend it. We all need reasons to be cheerful at the moment. Pretty much most of the east coast of Australia, excepting where Wayne is in the beautiful state of Queensland, is in lockdown. So yeah, if you need a good pick-me-up, I'd recommend both the book and the Reasons to Be Cheerful podcast. I just listened to a great episode on Lidos. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes,
Ed?
You are. Outdoor swimming pools, which it sounds like more a thing for Australia than for Britain, doesn't it? But there's a growing Lido movement here.
It's a wonderful episode. Australia does have a lot of beautiful ocean pools, I think, built around the same time as the UK's Lidos, and they look phenomenal. And it's a really lovely episode, a good entry, I would think, to the podcast overall. I'm going to go now to questions. As I said, we've got more than 800 people on with us tonight, so we've already got quite a few here. We'll try and get to as many as we can. The first question is from Ian Howie. He says, can you please comment on the loss of ministerial responsibility? There's evidence, not evidence, that no one is accountable for anything nowadays. He's got a couple of Australian specific examples here, like Robodebt and the West Sydney Airport sale car parks, or car porks as someone has called them here. Wayne, I'll get you in a second, but what's the state of ministerial responsibility like in Westminster, Ed?
Low, I would say. Look, I think there is a sort of, I think this is a right-wing, at least in the UK, it's a right-wing phenomenon, which is that I think Johnson learns from the Trump model, which is never say you're sorry, never admit wrong, and sort of, just go beyond shame in a way, be shameless. And I sort of think that is his MO, and I think it's a sort of it's a massive problem. I mean, the sort of very notorious example here that we've had recently was Dominic Cummings and his comings and goings, so to speak, during the his Johnson's chief advisor during when there was lockdown and he wasn't observing it and so on. And he's tried to sort of now explain. He's now left the government and is very critical of Johnson, but has now tried to explain it away. But it's not just that. It's a whole range of ministerial actions, wrongdoing that has basically there's been no accountability for. And look, I mean, all it does, I think, is it increases cynicism in politics. And in a way, look, part of I mean, I don't want to just go on about Johnson, but part of Johnson's approach to this, and there's a very good long read written about him in The Guardian, which people should look at from a few months ago, about the clown. The idea of the clown is that he sort of wants to almost say that nothing is serious and that it's all, he feeds on a sense of cynicism about politics in a way that a lot of it's quite a joke and not serious and so on. And I think that's very dangerous for democracy, and I think it's dangerous for politics. And we've got to be the people who uphold standards and accountability.
Yeah, that idea of the clown and not taking things seriously and feeding on cynicism certainly reminds me of a few Australian politicians. But Wayne, what are your observations on ministerial responsibility given the series of rorts that we've seen lately?
Well, I mean, the fact that on Robodebt, which was so damaging, such a significant impact on so many people, that no minister has paid a price for that is extraordinary. And it appears that no price now or no circumstances would, under the current government, justify anyone being stood aside. It's extraordinary, and it's probably a bit like Britain, and I think there's a lot in the approach that Ed just described here as well.
The next question is from Kit Regan. He says, or she, sorry, I don't want to misgender you there, Kit. While many of us are excited for change, some people are experiencing change fatigue, and post-COVID, many may want to go back to the pre-COVID days. How do we bring people who are tired or scared along with us, Ed?
It's a really good question that Kit asks, and I've talked quite a lot about this over the last few months, because Wayne mentioned earlier when Britain came out of the Second World War and there was this big appetite for change. And I think that is a really important sort of analogy in terms of what our ambition should be. And it's one that we've used here. I think the difference is that there is a sort of depth, it's paradoxical. There's people desperately keen to go back to normality, see friends and family, live normal lives and so on. And I think it's completely understandable if we feel it ourselves. And at the same time, we can't let the lessons of what happened during the pandemic, the deep inequalities, which mean that Britain has been so badly affected, what's happened to our public services, the pay of key workers, which has been a massive issue here, the most valued workers, the most insecure, the lowest paid. We can't let those lessons be swept under the carpet. So I think this is quite tricky, really. I think it's about embracing that desire for people to go back to normalcy, but also normality, but also saying, look, as a country, we owe it to those who have suffered, which I believe we do, and we owe it to ourselves to learn the deep lessons of the crisis. And actually, it's interesting when you take the climate issue, I was looking at some polling on this, there is a real sense that, just like we're right to follow the science when it comes to COVID, so we've got to follow the science and understand the science on climate. I think there is an understanding of people that we've got to learn lessons from this crisis.
Wayne, change fatigue?
I've got a much more optimistic point of view, which might be completely out of sync with many people on the broadcast. I've been really excited, if you like, and pleased with what I've seen has been a strong community response to basically a common purpose. In defeating this pandemic, we've seen people engage in public health measures, whether it's mask wearing and all of the associated requirements that have been put on, and done it, I wouldn't say in a cheerful way, but with an acknowledgement that, in fact, we are all in it together. So, where we've seen protest movements, whether it's about the public health measures, mask wearing, mandates, they have been minuscule. They have been absolutely minuscule. So I've actually take great faith that there has been, at a grassroots level in Australia, a lot of community solidarity and understanding that if we need to take collective measures for collective good. And I didn't think in my lifetime I would have necessarily seen such a strong response amongst all ages, all groups. They had a rally about the border control down on the Queensland-New South Wales border at Coolangatta. And that's terrible for the people that are on the border. But it was relatively small because I think essentially people understand even there where it is difficult, that these difficult measures have to be taken. So I would say that there is a degree of solidarity it's a word we use in the labour movement a lot, a degree of solidarity in support for the public responses, which have been opposed by significant sections of the business community and so on at various stages. And they've got behind their political leaders that were asking for some form of collective sacrifice. So what I would say is that, collective sacrifice for a better world is still in people's heads and is waiting to be harnessed by some inspiring policies in different directions.
No, it's a good observation. And it reminds me, in Australia, we've seen the Sikh community, for example, step up and cook and provide meals both after the bushfire crisis and also, for example, to public housing towers when they were under strict lockdowns during the pandemic, and, people looking after elderly relatives and making sure they've got the food delivered to them and all of that kind of stuff. I think that's a really good point. And it brings me to my next question, which is from Janathana, I hope I've pronounced that correctly. In the book, Ed, you talk about how you went to a community organising training and saw huge value in it and said that all MPs should go to one, which they couldn't agree with more as an organiser and Labor Party member themselves. And you also then provided an example about how your local Doncaster branch engaged in their own community organising around local issues. The question is, how do you think local branches and party structures can really embed a community organising strategy as bread and butter? And are there any more UK or Doncaster examples that could inspire Australian Labor Party spaces?
Well, I'm really glad that that question got asked. So when I lost the election in 2015, I went, I grew a beard, which is, I think, what sometimes male politicians do when they lose elections. Anyway, I actually came to Australia and had a fantastic holiday with my family in Australia. Anyway, then I came back and I went on this community organising course. And I look, at the beginning, I felt a bit of a fish out of water. It was a 5-day training that different community groups were engaged in. It run by a great organisation called Citizens UK. And I had tried when I was leader to get the community organising ethic into the way the party did its work with a guy called Arnie Graff, a US community organiser. And it sort of worked and sort of hadn't, because it was very hard running up against the sort of kind of electoral necessities of the immediate electoral necessities of door knocking and so on. And I found this a really inspirational course to do. And it then led to me doing a local community campaign against a a kind of a company in my constituency that also actually extends across the country, which it's now since actually gone into liquidation. It basically sells white goods like cookers and so on to people, to poor people at vastly inflated prices, huge interest rates and so on. It's like a sort of payday lender, but for white goods. And it led to this community campaign. And I think it's so interesting, this, and it does actually go back to something that Wayne said earlier, which is you need the policy, but you also need the infrastructure in place to spread your message, make your arguments. And the thing that really struck me about the Bright House campaign that we did, this campaign, was it was the Labour Party not saying to people, please vote for us, but saying to people, this is something that we care about in our community and that we're campaigning on. It's not about whether you vote for us or not. And I think there is a way in which we, even in these times that we're in, we need to learn the lessons of our past, which is, how did Labour parties grow? By being embedded in communities and showing that we were part of them and we could affect change. And I think there's something very inspiring about the community organising movement, because it says that anyone, however powerless they might appear, has got the capacity to join with others to bring about change. And in a way, you need that bottom-up and top-down change. So I would like to see the Labour Party in Britain, and this is actually being done in different ways, doing more of how do we mobilise our members not to talk to each other, but to go out, talk to the public, but also kind of organising communities to show that we can affect change. And I think there are a lot of principles from the community organising movement that we could apply.
Wayne, did you want to respond to that?
Well, it's a model I always followed as an MP, and I hope all of our MPs do. Some do, some don't, I guess. But it's absolutely critical in a local area that the community, that you're out in the community doing what they're doing. And, whether it's being involved in local movements or protest movements about particular events that are happening, or whether it's being out there supporting junior sport, or whether it's, supporting activities on Australia Day, whatever they may be. Significant community events require activists to be at them, not talking at people about policy, but being with them in celebrating, once again, to use that word, their solidarity around their issue or their activity. So you can deeply involve yourself in conservation issues. You can involve yourself in disability issues. You can involve yourself in housing issues. And that's the basis of politics. I mean, we live in a community and as a political party, we need to make sure we've got those grassroots where party members are actually members of local organisations, and we get feedback about what's going on, and it becomes a virtuous loop. And that is the way to win and hold communities.
The next question is from Izzy Manfield. It is, should Labor, and I think by that she means maybe Australian Labor, should Labor go big as an opposition election strategy, or should we only go big after winning government or in a second term? The question is go big a style of government, or is it a campaigning style? Ed?
I think I might leave the advice for Australian Labor to Wayne, really.
I'll go for UK Labor as well.
Let me say something about our own situation, because we're formulating policy for the next election. Look, in a way, I think that, so I'll talk about the last 3 elections in Britain and their sort of offer lessons in a way. 2015, I lost. I feel like in retrospect I should have been bolder. I had good analysis of the problems that the country faced, but I don't think the solutions were quite big enough, and therefore that's part of the reason why it was hard to get a message across. In 2017, Jeremy Corbyn, who was then the leader, had if you like, a turbocharged version of my 2015 manifesto. He didn't win the election. He came mightily close under very unexpected circumstances. And then in 2019, we crashed down to a terrible defeat. And he kind of, in a way, went even bigger than 2017. I think there's a sort of lesson in this, which is, look, for us, it's, and Keir Starmer, our leader, has said this, tinkering around the edges is not the answer. We do need big solutions to the problems we face, but people have to have a sense of priorities. If you say you can do everything all at once, people aren't going to believe it. So it's got to pass a credibility test. But in my view, at least for the UK context, I can't speak for the Australian context, It's got to pass a sense of, is this equal to the scale of the crises we face? And I actually think that's our best chance of convincing the public and winning the election. So that's the kind of position it is. But we're at the moment formulating policies for the next election. We're in sort of relatively early stages of the parliament, but that's how it looks from here.
Yeah. Wayne, there's a couple of questions in here, and I think in the comments as well, as kind of saying people are really behind this idea of going big, but it appears like Labor's got more of a small target strategy this time around. What are your kind of comments on that?
Well, it's a matter of public record that our electoral review found correctly, in my view, that we offered too many big policies all at once. And we would have been far better off sequencing them. A very good example here is Biden. Biden had a very big policy agenda. Sanders and others wanted an even bigger one. Well, Biden's was still pretty big, and he won. And in that vote, they lost in the House of Reps. They actually went backwards. So I think you've just got to be careful. I'm in favour of big changes, but you can't do too many at once. So I think you can indicate direction, but in terms of an electoral cycle, there's only so many big changes you can communicate, sell, garner public support for at the same time. And if you try and do with too many at once, you set yourself up for what happened to Bill Shorten and Labor in the last federal election, which was they ran a multitude of scare campaigns, admittedly with $80 million of Clive Palmer's money across a range of policy areas, and it became almost impossible to defend. So there's a sweet spot. I'm in favour of big and significant changes over time. Medicare was big, but we should never forget we just can't put it in our pocket. We've got to go back and defend it. So you can't fight on everything at once.
Thanks, Wayne. The next question is from Lynn Holtain. Where do Ed and Wayne stand on the concept of a universal basic income sitting within a strategy to address inequality? Ed?
That's a great question. So in my I've got this sort of slightly paradoxical position on the universal basic income, which is, if somebody said to me, what's the one idea in your book that could be most transformative, I would say the universal basic income. For those who don't know, the universal basic income is this idea that you pay a flat rate foundation to everybody in your society as a basic kind of right of citizenship. In a way, it would replace some parts of the means-tested social security system. Why would it be transformative? Because it basically gives everyone a floor as a basic right to live on unconditionally and universally. I don't think that the people who say, well, everyone would give up work are right, because I think it wouldn't be set at such a high level that people would say, well, it's not worth bothering to work, but it would give people the kind of security that so often middle or upper class people can take for granted. It gives them the right to say no to certain jobs they don't want to do. It would be transformative. That said, this is the paradox. I also think it's the policy that is kind of furthest away in terms of being able to happen soon. When you look at the numbers, Hillary Clinton said this in her campaign. She said she looked at doing what she called Alaska for America. So this basic, in Alaska, they have this $2,000 person payment from the oil revenues, annual payment. And she said just the numbers didn't add up. I think the numbers are very difficult. When you face all the other problems in your society, you think, is this really the priority for now? But I think it's an idea that deserves to be kept alive, not least because automation, the way technology is going to change jobs people do, insecurity, there's a whole range of things that could mean, I think it could kind of gather momentum as an idea. And it's being piloted and tested in different parts of the world, which I think is a good thing. I think we'll see some results of that. And there are certain principles you can apply. Actually, funnily enough, the furlough, it wasn't a universal basic income. The furlough we had here, which is sort of paying people 80% of their wages, it's not a million miles away from that idea. And we have seen some pretty transformative effects in terms of people then thinking, what job am I going to do in the future, and so on. So I think it's got a lot of resonance. Last thing I'd say on it is that there is something that you could do in the shorter term, and I say this in the book, which is a kind of universal social inheritance. We had this thing in Britain called the Child Trust Fund, which paid every 18-year-old for a certain set of cohorts till we got kicked out of government, a few £1,000s on reaching 18 as a foundation. And that's like a lump sum. It's a much cheaper alternative, and it gives people that asset base that, again, middle class people can maybe more take for granted.
Yeah, Wayne, talking about that Alaska payment there, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's derived from their royalties or taxes from their resources in Alaska. Is that right, Ed? Wayne, you've had a run-in with fossil fuel companies in Australia, but presumably if we tax them more effectively, we might be able to do something similar to the Alaska payment here.
Well, we wouldn't do that like that. I mean, I'm in favour of a strongly progressive tax system for both corporates and for individuals. And I'm absolutely against paying a standard payment to people who don't need it. That is, people on high incomes and are very wealthy. And I think what we need to do is to go back to the architecture which says that we have a fiscal policy that delivers full employment, that we have a decent and generous minimum wage, and that we have a decent and generous social security system for those people that are not temporarily in work. Because I tell you, I've done the numbers on a universal payment. It doesn't add up, and it doesn't work. It doesn't add up at all. And what we really want to do is get back to a very generous social security system or social welfare system, the likes of which was constructed after the Second World War in both Australia and Great Britain, and put in place to beat off fascism on one hand and communism on the other. That's all been eroded by 30 or 40 years of attacks on that social security safety net, tax on minimum wages, a tax on workers' rights. We're just got to go back to the basic architecture. The basic architecture is well-paid, good, decent jobs, and a good, strong social safety net backed up by a policy of full employment.
Yeah, we've touched on a whole bunch of topics related to inequality, and people on the line might be interested in a recent Australia Institute report which looked at the explosion of wealth in Australia, not income, but wealth in Australia. People's assets are worth 12.7 trillion, and wealth grew by 1.7 trillion to the year March 2021 this year. That's almost as much as Australia's total GDP, and we've certainly made the argument that that's not taxed effectively in Australia at the moment. People can find that on australiainstitute.org.au. Ed, we've only got a couple of minutes to go. Knowing that this was loosely inspired by reasons to be cheerful when you're at a low point in your life, can you leave us with some reasons to be cheerful before we sign off tonight?
Yeah, okay. Well, that's definitely. I'll tell you what I think inspires me more than anything in thinking about this book. And it does go back to something that Wayne said about what happened during the lockdown and COVID. Actually, I think there is a spirit among people, and I think a spirit of solidarity. And I think it's matching that spirit of solidarity with the way we run our institutions. And I think what's happened is, over the last 30 or 40 years, is our institutions have got further and further away from the spirit of actually people's solidarity. It's like we need to match our institutions with the best of us. And I think we have seen the best of us during this period. And then the other thing that I'd say inspires me, and I think this is a lesson for all of us actually, is the young people who are campaigning on climate change. And in a way, I think we all need to think like the youngest generations who are campaigning on the climate crisis, because they are going to have to live with this for longer than any of us. And I'm just talking about me and Wayne here, Ebony, rather than you. And they speak for future generations who are going to be impacted by this. And so I think, in a way, and the other thing about young people is they're not cynical. Many of them are not cynical about what politics can achieve. And I think we've got to think like them. And that is a sense of idealism and a sense of urgency when it comes to the problems that our world faces. And if we do that, if we have idealism and urgency and imagination, and in a sense, we trust the public a bit, because the public know that there's lots of problems with our society and they need solving, then I actually think we can't go far wrong.
Thank you so much. We'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you to Ed Miliband, coming to us all the way from the UK, and Wayne Swan for joining us this evening. We really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for coming along tonight, and for all your great questions. Don't forget, grab a copy of Ed's book if you can. And if you can't, I highly recommend the Reasons to Be Cheerful podcast. Also, don't forget to check out the Australia Institute's podcast, Follow the Money. The last couple of episodes tackle that wealth explosion that we talked about. We talked to Richard Dennis, our chief economist, and we've also done one recently looking at some of the assumptions in the Doherty Institute modelling for the national plan, and really looking at the importance not just of vaccinations but of the test, trace, isolate and quarantine public health measures. And there's some concerning assumptions in there that people might be interested in as well. We've got more exciting webinars coming up. You can find all of that and our fabulous research on climate change, on inequality, as well as the work from our centres, the Nordic Policy Centre, the Centre for Future Work and the Centre for Responsible Tech. All of those cover issues covered in Ed's book. You can head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to find all of those. And don't forget to sign up for future webinars. Next week, we'll be looking at ending the incarceration of children and raising the age of criminal responsibility. And again, we'll be talking to the head of the Burnett Institute about what other public health measures beyond vaccinations we can use to keep COVID under control. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate your time. Stay safe out there, get vaccinated as soon as you can, and hopefully we'll see you at a future webinar. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Wayne. Thanks, Ebony.
Take care.
Bye.